What is up, guys? Rick Cacus here, and today it's time for another episode of Fan-Made Exotics, the only series that lets you submit an exotic weapon, armor, ghost shell, or heck, any Destiny exotic idea and have a chance for realistic concept art to be made for it. Now that's because I've partnered with the artists Michael, aka Rageblade, and Benjamin Radiman. Both of them will have their DeviantArts linked in the description down below. Now on the docket for today's video, we are going to showcase 5 featured exotics that all came from the comment section of last video, and then we're going to talk about some tips for how to get selected. And lastly, we're going to shout out all of the different concepts made since last episode. But firstly, guys, if you're interested in submitting an exotic idea, all you need to do is make a comment in the comment section down below. Make sure to detail any information about how your exotic would look for the artist if they do choose you, as well as any of its perks, stats, and of course include any exotic perks it has. Now additionally, if you're planning on making a submission, make sure you're doing it on the newest Fan-Made Exotics video. If there's a newer video than this one, an annotation will appear right now leading you to it. And lastly, guys, if you enjoy this series and want to see more, please remember to support the video by liking, commenting, and especially sharing. We really do appreciate it. Now let's get started with the 5 featured concepts. The first one is going to be from Michael, and the last 4 are going to be from Benjamin. The first one is the Draga Dao exotic spear concept by Front 7 Gallagher. This thing just looks fantastic. And if you're wondering, how would a spear work in Destiny? Well, it would work perfectly fine. Bungie has a great opportunity to greatly expand its melee weapons arsenal by simply messing around with attack speed, attack distance, and stuff like that. Right now, every sword swings the same way. So a spear, for example, would have a longer time to attack, but perhaps have a further reach. That would make it pretty damn balanced and pretty damn interesting. But this exotic spear has a few interesting exotic perks additionally. Now firstly, the actual exotic perk, the heavy attack, which is activated the same as the other exotic heavy attacks on the current exotic swords in Destiny, is called Cell Limit Break. Now what this does is it sends out a shockwave around you, kind of like a mini landfall or Fist of Havoc, but obviously doing less damage, not able to kill surrounding guardians perhaps in a single shot, just weaken them a ton. We can always mess around with the damage and balance after the fact, but that's the ability. Now it also has the exotic passive perk, Lightning Detour. This is going to be the defensive ability for this melee weapon, like holding up the Void Wall defense of the Void exotic sword, the Dark Drinker. Now what this exotic ability does is that it deflects incoming damage. However, the more bullets you deflect, the stronger Cell Limit Break gets, but it also does cost more ammo. So if you're sitting there deflecting a ton of incoming damage and then use the exotic heavy melee ability, you're going to slam the ground, and that shockwave is going to potentially deal somewhere near a Fist of Havoc. That's going to be pretty cool. Of course, you're using up a ton of ammo when you're doing this, and you're putting yourself at a lot of risk, just kind of sitting there and taking damage, hoping everything will go well, but it definitely is a pretty damn cool ability. Lastly, we have the optional perk, which you can choose this over more spare ammo, called Momentum. What this does is that when you're running with this spear, you'll start to move faster and faster and faster and get a decent agility bonus. That's also quite interesting. Now, of course, giving up more spare ammo is a pretty big downside, but it can make aggressive plays with this exotic more susceptible to success. Like if you're in PvP and you actually want to close the gap, that perk will let you do that. All in all, very interesting exotic, and it's a great example of an exotic spear that could be introduced into Destiny and probably fit in pretty well. Now, some of the abilities do sound very powerful, but remember, it is a heavy weapon, and so the ammo limitations are really what's going to keep this thing in check. Now moving on, the next exotic weapon we're going to showcase is the Silent Knight, exotic auto rifle concept by Alex Cifrele. Now this has a couple of very interesting exotic abilities. Firstly, it has the passive perk Dead of Night. Now this has two different effects, one in PvP and one in PvE. In PvP, what it does is that kills make you undetectable on enemy radar for 5 seconds. If you get a kill, this will reset the timer, so technically, as long as you keep getting kills within those 5 seconds, you can go indefinitely stealthing it up. Next up in PvE, kills make the red health level mobs not target you for 5 seconds. Resets timer from kills. So as long as you keep getting kills, you're going to shift the aggro to other players. Next up, we have the exotic perk Silent Knight. Getting multi-kills on enemies within one magazine will silence the weapon for the next magazine. Hits with silence rounds track the target, making them visible through objects and walls. Each hit adds 2 seconds to a maximum 4-second timer for making them visible. So, a lot of very interesting stuff going on here, but let's break it down. Firstly, the PvP side of this perk, making you undetectable on radar for 5 seconds after a kill, that's fantastic. I don't know why that isn't, frankly, that should be a perk. Like, that should actually be a new perk in the game for any weapon that does that, like called Silencer or whatever. That would be awesome. That would be actually pretty usable, and it would compete with the other, perks in the game. And so I think that's perfectly balanced. However, in the PvE side of things, I think that's a little overpowered. Not getting shot every time you just kill a thrall, shifting aggro or making the aggro less likely to target you, I think that's the way to go. So you can certainly still be attacked, but just not as likely. And if there's an enemy standing beside you, or I should say an ally standing beside you, the enemies are more likely to shift to them. So that's pretty interesting there. As for the exotic perk, frankly, there's not really a huge problem with this. It's basically like Keen Sense for the Night Stalker Hunter, but a little harder to activate and on a gun. I think that would be quite useful as well. So overall, pretty interesting abilities and pretty interesting attempt as a stealth weapon, something that really is kind of missing from Destiny right now. Now moving on, we have the AS-23 Alpha, exotic shotgun concept by D. Brown 102902. This shotgun has some very unique abilities. Firstly, and something I absolutely love, it has the intrinsic perk Semi-Auto. This weapon doesn't need to be pumped back after every shot. So you just shoot it and keep shooting it. Every shotgun right now in Destiny, except for the Lord of Wolves, is pump action, if you can believe it. Semi-auto magazine-fed shotguns is something Bungie should definitely look into, and this does kind of address that. In addition to that intrinsic perk, we also have the exotic perk Focused Aggression. When aimed down sights, the longer you hold the trigger, the shot will have more range and damage as well as a tighter bullet spread. So, pretty interesting exotic shotgun here. Firstly, it is a lead firing machine. The semi-auto perk coupled with a high rate of fire is going to make this gun able to mow down multiple enemies who perhaps aren't looking at you. However, it doesn't do the most damage. It won't be able to one-hit kill enemies at any discernible big ranges, and so you do lose out to those instant kill shotguns like the Matador 64. However, its exotic ability is very interesting. You can basically use this weapon almost like a fusion rifle, where you aim down sights, you hold the trigger, and then the longer you hold it gets more and more and more accurate and becomes more similar to one of those long-range shotguns. Then when you release the trigger, it's going to do that big damage. Now, of course, the downside is that even a fusion rifle, you can start to charge before you aim down sights. When you're aiming down sights, you have less movement speed and your aiming is slowed, so you're going to have a harder time acquiring those targets. If you can make it work, it's going to be very powerful, but it is something you are going to have to work for, unlike the Matter 64, which is just point and click. In any event, I think this would be a very interesting gun. Perhaps it just wouldn't be competitive enough in PvP, but in PvE, this thing would be a blast to use. Now moving on, we have the Zero Mercy Exotic Titan Helmet concept by Gabrieloid Studios. Now this exotic is pretty cool, but also pretty complicated, so bear with me. Firstly, we have the intrinsic perk Eros. This grants increased armor, making you harder to kill, and then we have all abilities have a faster cooldown period. That seems like a little bit much, just tacked on for the sake of tacking on something. I'm not really a fan of that. However, the exotic perk is called Thantos. What this does is that when an enemy is killed, you gain a slight armor buff and it stacks up to 10 times. However, upon death, with the maximum stacks, so as long as you've killed 10 full enemies, you will consume your super, so you use up a full super and all of your stacks to self-revive. So there you have it, giving Titans the ability to revive. Well, the one problem with this is that no one would use Warlocks after that, right? But in all honesty, it is a very interesting idea. I think it definitely needs to be changed if it was going to be iterated into the game, but I do like this idea. What I would do is keep the base premise, where you have to kill enemies to get armor stacks, and then when you get 10 armor stacks and you die, you will be instantly revived. However, you will have to have a full super for this to happen, and it will use up that super. I think those are all good ideas, and it's a great way of introducing a way to revive to a class that doesn't really have it. However, the one thing I would add is a timer to the stacks, so they would only last, 10 to 20 seconds. So that means you're gonna have to be killing enemies once every 10, 15, 20 seconds. You can't just hold on to those stacks forever. For example, during the raid, during the Vosic fight, when you're killing a bunch of those enemies and you're being very aggressive, and then you're going to get those 10 stacks very easily, you're going to have no trouble keeping those 10 stacks up, and then if you do die, you will get revived. Of course, again, it will cost your super, so it's not like a freebie res, but it is a way to grant that extra survivability to a Titan class that normally doesn't really have that. But when you're traveling from, let's say, Vosic to the Siege Machine, and you're going along that route, you're going to lose all of your stacks. You're going to have to gain them again. That's the only thing I would really change. But all in all, very interesting idea. Something I really hope Bungie sees and takes a look at. Now moving on, the last exotic concept we're going over today is the Shock Spring, exotic sidearm concept by In the Dark. Now this weapon has two exotic perks that you have to choose between. The first one is called Shockwire. Getting a precision kill with this weapon will make you supercharged for 15 seconds. While you're supercharged, any melee damage you take will be reflected equally upon the attacker as well. So let's just talk about that for a sec. That's actually a pretty useful, especially for PvP, but also actually PvE, where if you get meleeed, that damage is going to be reflected right back at your attacker. Now, that isn't, in my mind, overpowered, because there's plenty of times where you're not going to be meleeed. You're just going to be shot at, and that ability will never come up. But if someone is getting aggressive, and you're able to get a precision kill, and there's another guy, and he's right next to you, and he melees you, yes, he still probably will kill you, but you might kill him back, and that's pretty useful. And in PvE, there's a lot of times, especially if you're versing an enemy faction like Hive and there's thralls charging at you, where being able to get one precision kill on a thrall and then make all the other thralls kill themselves when they're meleeing you, that is pretty damn cool. The second exotic perk that you can choose between is Shock Spring. While holding this weapon, you lose your melee attack, but instead gain the ability, by pressing that melee attack button, to fire the knife from the front of the gun, gaining an increased melee range, but at the cost of some damage. So it basically replaces your melee ability. Like if you're Titan, it would replace your Storm Fist melee ability with the ability to shoot out this knife. Basically, it would give you a throwing knife. It would change your melee ability, and in many scenarios, depending on what you want to do, that can be quite useful. Just the idea of having a weapon that replaces a certain ability is something that Bungie hasn't looked into and really should. Weapons with bayonets, for example, that should replace your melee ability with a lunging attack from the weapon, having a better range but perhaps doing a little bit less damage or something like that. And this is just another very creative example of that. So that's going to be it for today's 5 featured concepts. Let's talk about some tips for getting selected. Firstly, try to make sure that your idea is realistic for Destiny. Getting a kill and turning into a dragon is cool, but it's never actually going to be in the game. Secondly, try to self-regulate your idea. Try to make sure that your idea is balanced. Getting a kill and instantly getting an overshield with any sort of weapon is probably overpowered, especially in PvP. Be aware of balance. Thirdly, try to make sure your idea isn't overly complicated. There's a lot of submissions where every single perk is unique and there's paragraphs upon paragraphs explaining what things do. If it would take me 10 minutes to explain your weapon, I can't pick you, you won't be selected. But, however, lastly, don't be afraid to completely break out of the traditional gun systems in Destiny. Don't be afraid to make SMGs, laser rifles, heavy sniper rifles, heavy hand cannons. We've had all of those things on this series, and heck, the first exotic was a spear. So again, don't be afraid to experiment. And lastly, let's shout out all of the different creations from last episode. Firstly, we have the Stargazers, exotic Titan leg armor by Johnny Jew. Next up, we have the Repeat Offender, exotic scout rifle concept by Peyton Godby. Now moving on from there, we have the ACD-0 Airstrike, exotic Titan armor concept by Cy Pitson. And lastly, we have the Broken Confluence, exotic auto rifle concept by Geno Was Here. And so guys, that's it for this episode of Fan-Made Exotics. Again, if you enjoy this series and want to see more, please remember to support the video. The current episodes aren't doing that great, so your support is really appreciated. And so guys, if you want to see more Destiny content and don't want to miss out on the next episode of Fan-Made Exotics, remember to slap that subscribe button and especially press the bell beside subscribe. Now if you guys want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter at RickCacus. That's linked in the description down below, as is my Twitch channel, which you can also follow. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.